Welcome, everyone. Apologize for the slightly rocky start, but we're all good to go. Thank you so much for being here. Just quickly, I want to thank our collaborators, the Connect Africa and Africa Institute. I want to thank our moderator, Claudia, and our wonderful panelists as well for being here. And with that said, to you, Claudia.
Manon, thank you very much. Kevin as well, and all the Africa Center and Africa Club, the students particularly, who worked very hard to bring such a wonderful panel together. So again, apologies for the late start. My name is Claudia Zeisberger. I'm a professor for entrepreneurship and family enterprise at INSEAD, and I look anything related to private capital as well. So why am I basically here to host this panel? So I'm clearly the least qualified person out of all my panelists. So I will make it my role to ensure that everyone is heard, that we hear your questions, and that we basically have a good, an interesting outcome for everyone who's participating in this panel. Now, before we start off, the plan for the session is as follows. We will basically, I will set a little bit the context of where I come from, purely from the private capital investment side, and from the work that I've done together with my husband on demographics in around the world. And there, obviously, Africa stands out supreme. I will set the context in a second. Please, you all, as participants in this panel discussion, this is set up as a webinar, so you cannot raise your hand or ask questions, but you can ask questions in the Q&A function on the bottom. Please start filling in the questions as soon as we start going. We're very happy to see those questions coming. I'm planning to interrupt at certain segue points to ensure that I address the questions and obviously address the questions to our distinguished panelists. Now, before I introduce the panel, I was asked to basically provide a bit of context on Africa and where I stand. As I said, I'm probably the least experienced when it comes to Africa, so please see this as an outside-in view. And obviously, for context as well, it is impossible to do the opportunity and the opportunity that is Africa to do it justice in a 1-hour panel. So I think we all are mindful of that. Our panelists as well come with very distinct experiences in specific parts of Africa, specific connections between Africa and Asia. And we will try in our questions to reflect that and be mindful of that. So on that note, let me go over to my slides. You all should be seeing my slides, which started off just early on saying Africa panel, road ahead for Africa. So, and as I said, this is my view on where I stand with my external investor hat on. So conversations that I have with private equity funds, with basically investors in those private equity funds and large asset allocators. So there's only one number that we're going to remember from this panel, I hope at least, and it's 1.4 billion. So 1.4 billion is an interesting number right now because at this point in time, 2024, we have 1.4 billion people living in China, in India, in Africa, and in the West. And in the West, I had to be very generous, add Brazil and everything else to it to even get to 1.4 billion, which gives you a little bit of an idea where the trajectory is going here. If I just take two of those continents, China and Africa, and look back, like I said, right now, 1.4 billion in both of them. If I go back to 1950, China's population was double that of Africa. Not that long ago. Now, obviously, the question now is like, how does this look in 2100? 2100, China's population will be dropping below 400 million, and Africa's population will expand to over 3 billion people. So Africa will be 10 times the size of China. So that is basically a little bit very high level where we go for. So now, when I look at anything, any country, and for background, being German originally, I have spent more than 30 years of my career in emerging Asia. So I interested in emerging markets. And when I look basically at Africa, I look at it with my entrepreneurs, my business, and potentially my government hat on. So what are the opportunities and where are the tailwinds? That's usually where I get asked about it. So now, education, again, anchoring on demographics. Here, I'm only looking at a very small window of the demographics of the world. And these are the 5 to 12-year-olds. So 5 to 12-year-olds, what's that? It's primary school and early years of secondary school education. So the world, as you can see, this is a graph until 2100, the number of 5 to 12-year-olds will drop rapidly, okay? So there's the world, and there's the world less Africa. As you can see, the 2023 was basically peak primary school time, if you like. So if you're an investor in education, that should basically give you some indication. So 235 million fewer 5 to 12-year-olds will we see in the world in the next 17 years. So 265,000 primary school students will disappear every week in the world without Africa. So the challenge has changed when you look at mandates from the World Bank, for example, 50 years ago, has moved from how do we educate the masses to where will we find the masses to educate. Now, that has had impact already on countries globally. So South Korea, since 1982, has closed 4,000 schools. So in Japan, some of the schools have started to replace students with mannequins. So this is basically the time to come. Again, to put it in context, China from now on forward will basically lose over 100 million of 5 to 12-year-olds. Even India, which is demographically much sounder than many countries, will have fewer 5 to 12-year-olds going forward. And here's the opportunity for Africa. Now, when I say it is the opportunity, it is also a challenge. So, and I will come back to that later on. To me, this is an opportunity to educate, to help Africa educate its many 5 to 12-year-olds that will be born between now and 2055. So I think the world needs to help Africa. We can't just leave Africa alone to handle this. This is one of the largest increases on 5 to 12-year-olds the planet has ever seen. So, and primary school students in Africa are literally the future. So for Africa and for the world. Now, my argument has always been that we must not only invest in education for African talent, and I include in that the 5 to 12-year-olds, which are your future entrepreneurs as well, but we also have to help Africa build investable companies. Why do I say that? As I do teach and speak on private capital quite a bit, I often get questions. Claudia, when will private equity finally pay attention to Africa? When will private capital finally come to Africa? And the answer to give on that is private capital is ready to come to Africa, but it has to find what I call investable companies, meaning those private capital funds, when they allocate capital, they have to put every company through a certain round of due diligence. If the first round of due diligence doesn't go well, they move on to the next company. That's the nature of the beast. That's their fiduciary duty towards their investors. So that is basically my final slide. So on that note, I will stop sharing my slides with some food for thought. And I will, again, encourage all of you that have joined us by now to add your questions to the Q&A function, please. And I will start introducing our panel. So first, again, thank you very much to all our panelists for making time. You all sit in different parts of the world, so I appreciate that this is not easy to kind of find time for such a long panel. Now, starting off, I'm just going to go in line with my screen. On the upper left side, I have Dominique Lecossois. Dominique is a colleague here at INSEAD. He's part of the Africa Initiative, distinguished fellow of our Africa Initiative and a professor at INSEAD. His background, Dominique has spent more than 30 years of working with and doing research on retail experiences across Asia and emerging markets. He was executive vice president for Carrefour in Asia, so he not only did research, he was hands-on involved basically in trying to drive this. And he has started to basically look at the opportunities for Africa as well, again, with the retail hat on. So Dominique, thank you for joining us. We then have Manyaka Kangai. Again, I'm going down my monitor as you are lined up in no particular order. He is the managing director at Muvambi Investments, and in one sentence, a China-Africa trade advisor. He has 13 years in trade and investment advisory in China-Africa relations, and he will be able to contribute to the conversation on the sometimes controversial conversation about the role of China in Africa and vice versa. Thank you for joining us. We then have Devashish Chaubey joining us. Thank you very much. He is global head of rice, special grains, and seeds at Olam. So Olam is a large corporate that literally, in my mind at least, having been based in Singapore for a long time, moves literally a large percentage of all the grains, seeds, and oils around the world, and is heavily involved in helping small-scale farmers to increase their output. So Devashish's expertise is global agriculture supply chain, climate smart practices, sustainable efforts in food supply chains, and he has experience in West Africa and in Southeast Asia, so perfect for this panel. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, not too much ago, sorry, Joshua Yao. Joshua is the next one on my list. He is CEO at Fair Money in Nigeria, former CEO of Opay in Nigeria as well. He is an entrepreneur. He has grown businesses, exited businesses, and grown them very quickly in a short period of time. His expertise particularly is fintech, including payments, digital currencies, and experience in strategy management and investment. And last but not least, Paulo Gomez from Orango Invest Africa and Southeast Asia, Chamber of Commerce advisor. So Paulo comes with a background in both public as well as private sectors. So you've spent time with the World Bank. You're an executive director for 24 African countries there. And in the private sector, you're chairman of Orango, board member at EcoBank and ASCII Airlines. Thank you all for joining me. So on that note, let's start off with some questions. Dominique, may I pass the first question to you, please? So you've spent half a lifetime leading development of retail markets in emerging Asia, and you're now involved more and more in Africa as well, expanding retail brands into West Africa. What lessons have you learned in Asia that you feel might be relevant to share with audiences in Africa as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. Good afternoon and good evening to all the participants, and thank you for having me. By the way, retail is a very investable sector, so it's keep this in mind. So what I learned and what can be really adapted to Africa. I mean, the first one is that the retail, especially mass retail, it's a really local affair. So we have to keep this in mind. Also, the question which has been helping me setting up a business across emerging market, and which I adapted to Africa, was you need to answer the question, well, why you are here, what are you going to do, and this will help you setting your strategy. Also, a very simple model who have been helping me as well, that I learned from setting a business across Asia, was you need to differentiate what you need to impose, what you need to adapt, and what you need to integrate. And also, sometime the mother company have a lot of requirement, a lot of SOPs, and when you set up a business in emerging market and in Africa as well, you need to simplify things and probably agree in terms of strategy 4 or 5 non-negotiable objectives that you need to do to achieve. Also, I always stress the fact that there's a huge need of developing an execution culture and rewarding the doers. Again, I mean, I'm in the industry which is human capital and human intensive, and what I discovered that there is a huge need of training, and especially on the success of retail is how good you are buying things. And for instance, just an example, there's a huge imbalance in emerging market between the commercial or retailer buying team and the vendors. So what we have been doing, and that's what we're doing as well in Africa, is try to reduce the gap of capability between the buying team and the vendors, and through very comprehensive training.
So, okay. Devashish, can I come to you next? So Africa is commonly known, and maybe not to everyone in our audience, to be a net importer of crop commodities. Is that correct? So
yes, it is. Yes, Claudia.
Yeah. So, which is basically, it's to many, when I speak to people, it's to many an eye opener, because obviously, given the slides I just showed before, you have 1.4 billion people and you're a net importer. So now you're growing to 3 billion people. So clearly there is need to kind of close that gap. So is that trend expected to continue? I mean, do you see that gap closing, or and if so, what should be done about it? Or if not, what would be useful to do to close the gap of making Africa potentially at least, maybe not an exporter, but at least a smaller net importer of important crops?
Sure. Thank you, Claudia, again. Yes, you're right. Africa continues to be a net importer of most crop commodities, as we call it in the agribusiness industry. And what they export, again, from this industry are mostly what we'll call as primary commodities or unprocessed agri-produce. This in spite of the fact that agriculture and agribusiness in Africa is amongst the larger industries there. Also, Africa, if we look at the unexploited arable land globally, 60% of the world's unexploited arable land resides in Africa. So from that perspective, this situation is a bit of a dichotomy, and will it change? How will it change is really the discussion that we'll have here. In my view, this is a trend which is set to continue, everything else remaining like it is today, right? Let me just delve a bit into how we see African. Again, we are generalizing when we say Africa. Africa itself is a very diverse continent comprising of various kinds of economies. But for the sake of the discussion here, let's say Africa by itself is mostly made up of smallholder farmers. And again, when I'm saying this, I'm kind of broad brushing, because there are countries like South Africa or Zimbabwe where farmers or farms are typically large scale. But broadly, if we talk of Africa, Africa typically has smallholder farmers. And most of these farmers suffer from very low productivity. We also know that because of the nature of the farm, these farmers being smallholder, these farmers are the most vulnerable to climate change as we are seeing today, right? So really, what can be done in this particular context, what we as OLAM typically are doing on the ground to try and change this and to try and bring about success of scalable agriculture in Africa. And I'll, to try and just make my point, I'll take the example of rice or paddy in this particular case. And what do we do in rice in Africa? One example of what we do is a fully mechanized large-scale farm for rice that we run in Nigeria, right? This farm is not intended to be a competition to the smallholder farmers. It is obviously intended to be a supply source of paddy for our own rice mills. But beyond that, this farm has really become a center for development. And when we talk of development, what does it mean? It is basically development towards finding out new varietals or varieties of paddy which can be grown properly in the agroclimatic conditions and in the soil types that we see in Nigeria. It has become a center where beyond the varietals, we also try and look at what best inputs to be given based on the soil types that we have. How do we grow paddy with lesser and lesser of water year after year? Is no-till farming of any relevance, amongst various other things? So that's the kind of development that really ends up happening at this farm, and that's the reason why we've set it up in Nigeria.
Right. Can I just ask you, I mean, because knowing that Olam has done quite a bit in India, for example, for small-scale farmers. I mean, have you seen there any lessons learned, good or bad, that you could see might be useful for different African countries?
The contexts are so different, Claudia, that really trying and juxtaposing some of the examples of what we've seen in India into Africa really doesn't play out, and which is what I was trying to come to. This whole thing about saying that there is a private entity which has to set up a farm and which is looking at, doing a lot of research and development activities at the farm, primarily comes about because for a lot of these crops, which can be grown in the African context, may not be grown cost competitively today, but which can be grown and which can act as import substitution for what is happening in Africa. There isn't enough of research and development which happens in Africa for these crops. So the primary, unlike Asia, so if you look at any country, and we are talking rice, so we can talk rice here, whether it be India, whether it be Thailand, whether it be Vietnam, there's a hell of a lot of research that happens into how to keep, taking farming of paddy from one stage to the next, based on development of population, based on consumption patterns that I've been having, or based on the need for improving productivity and yields from year to year. Africa, unlike this, has not had any of that. So really trying and juxtaposing our examples of what we've done in India. In India, what we typically do, Claudia, is to try and move farming practices, specifically in rice, towards more sustainable practices. Yeah. While we keep working towards trying and improving productivity and earnings for the farmers, our primary focus currently is to try and move farming towards more sustainable practices, using less water, being a lesser generator of the greenhouse gases. That is really what our focus is, how to try and get carbon sequestration in the soil, in the farms that our farmers groups are typically planting. That's really our focus.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Devashish. And again, we had quite a few people joining us. So whilst this is a panel on Africa, I just had someone asking a question that we are all very mindful that Africa is a composition of 54 different countries. Sadly, we cannot run 54 hours of webinars. So we have basically asked the panelists to grab their individual expertise and relate it to the various places where they have experience. Devashish, thanks very much for kind of carving out different countries for their different practices in Africa as well. So let's go, I'll jump over in line with my screen to Manika. Manika, you've developed your business around matchmaking of Chinese and African companies, observed Chinese businesses over the years. What are some of the successful Chinese businesses in Africa? And what can we all learn from them? Or do you have some stories you can tell us that would be relevant? Welcome and thank you.
Greetings to everybody all over the world. Yes, there have been, a few successes that have happened actually on the African continent with Chinese companies, and they're all in different sectors. Of course, we don't have enough time to go through a lot of them, but I'll just touch on a few that we can share. I'll start off with a company called Huawei, which I think, in my personal view, is one of the more successful Chinese companies on the African continent. This is a company that arrived in Africa at a time when a lot of the European companies were leaving, and they stuck it out. It was a difficult period, but they came in of the infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure that we find throughout Africa. I think at some point, 3G, probably almost half of the 3G networks throughout Africa were coming through companies like Huawei. We've seen that increase with 4G, and even right now with 5G, Huawei is actually powering a lot of the technology. So what Huawei has done well when they came in, first of all, was the mindset they came in with, and maybe it's because of the experience and seeing what happened in China. They came in with a long-term view and worked through the challenges that were on the ground. They didn't make money for quite a while, but that eventually turned around. They also partnered with state companies, telecommunication state companies, and they came in at the perfect time when companies were being given licenses to be able to start building telecommunications networks throughout Africa. So they came in and partnered, so timing was crucial. Execution was also crucial, understanding the environment. They also helped companies access financing because a lot of the African state companies didn't have the financing, and so they were able to organize financing as well. So they brought financing, they executed well, they came in at the perfect time. And of course, they partnered with the right businesses. So even up to today, Huawei has partnered with a lot of the telecom companies throughout Africa, and they're continuing to push technology products through them. So that's one example. We look at another company that is in Ethiopia right now called Huajian, which is a shoe manufacturer. They actually manufacture shoes that are exported to the US and to Europe. They set up a factory in Ethiopia. Again, not an easy environment, but they took the chance and set up the company. They partnered with government and were given, different concessions and land to build factories on. And so they've actually taken advantage of some of the trade agreements that African countries have. For example, there's the AGOA Act, the American, I think it's American Opportunity Act that allows African products into the American market. And because they're producing their products in Ethiopia, this has allowed them to also access those other markets too. They've also been able to access the African markets. If you set up in a company, in a country, in one of the African countries, there's so many trade agreements where they've tried to create common markets. And so setting up in Ethiopia, for example, you have access to probably 600 million people because there's a common market called COMESA, which is the common market for East and Southern Africa. And so this gives you access to a market of about 600 million people, and you have favorable trade terms. So you're able to export into some of these different countries. They've also set up operations in Nigeria as well that they're working on. So those are a couple of them.
Thanks very much. Thank you for sharing it. Allow me to jump on to Paolo. Paolo, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. Given your leadership roles in the public sector, what is, in your opinion, some of the key kind of tailwinds or headwinds, either side of the coin, for doing business in Africa, just from a policy sector? And I have already a question here that would also link to that as well later on. But first, over to you, please.
Yes, I've left the public sector many years ago. But I think a lot of has changed since then. If you look at the time where the majority of the policy inputs that were coming recommended to African countries were essentially boxed into the structural adjustment programs, and following the very hard package of policies of the Washington Consensus about fiscal policy, tight monetary policies. And then I think, luckily, slowly, we saw that there was a need to have a much more comprehensive policy mapping to take into account elements of the private sector, much focus on changing the investment climate, and also finding ways to adapt the financing needs to the countries. I think the discussion about the challenge with Olam that they were mentioning about the challenge on developing agriculture. I think for many years people focus on the research and things that need to be done, putting basic infrastructure, but there was a big gap on the importance to have specific tools to support the financial, the farming, the agriculture, with financial instruments very specific to the African needs. And for two, we have very small farmers, so we don't have those aggregated kind of farms in Brazil, India, and other emerging markets. So it's a challenge to find a way to adapt some financial instruments to support the farmers. So we still need to address those issues. But I think a lot has changed. There is a better understanding on the importance of some of the policies. As I said, the private sector aspect now is a cross-cutting issues in all the policy making in Africa. It wasn't the case for many years. Now I think we African countries have understood much of the policies that they need to implement. But what's happening is that we are losing talent in the public sector. So you have a well mapped out set of policies that need to be implemented, but you're finding now that you don't have that talent pool in the administration to help implement those policies because people are leaving the public sector. And so you have a challenge of implementing those policies in many African countries. So that's one of the major, I think, challenge that we need to recognize here. The weakness of the states is not helping implement those policies. If you look at example like Singapore, you have a very capable state, and I will even say an entrepreneurial state that sometimes you need in order to be innovative and agile to implement those policies. In many African countries, this is missing at this point. So I think I will kind of pinpoint that weakness as one of the major challenge at this point. And why do you need this capable state and an entrepreneurial state? Because you have so many shocks at the global level.
Well, you have so many shocks, and as I showed earlier on as well, you have a whole continent that is, and that's one thing that we can say for sure, a very young continent. So you have a young population that does need guidance and needs basically someone who kind of takes the lead and implements certain efforts that are important, as you rightly said. Can I jump over to you? So we got your video going too. Thank you so much. So China basically is at the forefront of innovation in fintech, right? I would argue as one of the countries out there, and solutions and models. Can you basically directly replicate? Similar question. Can you think of some of the technologies that can be useful, helpful, replicated in Africa to help basically businesses or small and medium enterprises?
When I was at OPay, which is probably the number one or number two highest value fintech in Africa now. So we were able to, for example, eventually after a lot of hard work, get the world's largest private sector investor, right, SoftBank, to go into Africa, right? We were SoftBank's first African investment. In that journey of doing OPay, which is the payment company in Nigeria, the original thesis was we take the time machine. Like we look at what happened in China, we think similar thing would happen in Africa because it's developing market. People eventually want the same things. So let's migrate the model. And then the very clear and unambiguous answer results that we found at the end was you cannot. So a lot of things for various reasons do not translate. So we look at, well, typically we literally burn, I remember at one point, OPay burned, I think, $40 million in 3 or 4 months to buy a motorbike, imported tens of thousands of motorbikes into Lagos, Nigeria, to start a Uber company for Africa. Because in China, that's how digital payment got popularized. So we thought we do the same because people need to pay. The WeChat business bought the China version of Uber. So we thought we were going to start a mobility company so that we can get people to use a digital wallet. And then at the end, it totally failed. So we burned $40 million there for nothing. So the short answer is you cannot. You only have to go and experiment and test with the local environment, the local market, what works and what doesn't work.
So I have some questions coming in. If you don't mind, I would like to jump over to some of the questions that have come in. So one is quite high level. Is it even being done? How prominent is trade between Asia and Africa, particularly given that the distance is very large and we still have a kind of emerging markets in Asia as well. So how active is trade between Asia and Africa? So I'm open if someone would like to cross over on it. Debashish, if you wanna take that up, or
just a simple answer to that is it is a thriving trade. I mean,
it is a thriving trade, but with headroom, there could be more done.
That's right. There obviously is headroom for growth, and there is a headroom for growth in the reverse direction, which is what is not happening today. In my books, most of what goes is Asia exporting into Africa, whether that be agri products like rice, or whether that be electronics or whatever else it be. The reverse flow of what comes into Asia from Africa, I think, is obviously of a much lower value.
Okay. Manika, you had your hand up as well.
Yes,
go ahead.
Yes. I was going to talk particularly around China. I think China-Africa trade, we're looking at about almost 300 billion that happened last year. So there is a bit of trade that's going on. Of course, a lot of it is resources that are being exported into the Chinese market. But we see that changing too, in that a lot of governments in Africa are implementing laws where they are forcing companies to process some of those raw materials locally before they're exported. But there is a lot of that still going out. And then we see a lot of technology coming in, a lot of mobile phones and consumer goods that are coming in as well from the Chinese market into Africa. So there is robust trade, but it depends as well on the country. Some countries actually have a trade surplus with China. Some might have a deficit, but there is a lot of trade going on.
Okay, both in both directions. So as Debashish said, reverse trade as well. Okay.
Yes, in both directions.
Now, a question to on the ground: is there any coordination among African countries to attract investors in crucial sectors, for example, for their respective development or for the trade side? Is there any coordination? Are there any efforts being made?
Well, I think at the personal level, I would say that is not enough. It's difficult to have that coordination intent. When we look at our own experience, what we have done, we have set up 10 years ago, actually, a Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, focusing essentially on Southeast Asia. And as a member, we have actually Olam, we have Wilmar, and many other companies in Southeast Asia. And I think it's important to segment that relationship with Asia, not to take it as a block. I think like Manika was saying, there's China, which is a very specific and set of opportunities. But I strongly believe that the big advantage should be in Southeast Asia. There's some similarities with, Singapore, in terms of, just climate-wise, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and also the dependency that we have. We import a lot of rice from those countries. I think there's a model of development that this set of countries in Southeast Asia have used that I believe that Africa can benefit a lot. So I don't see that big coordination happening. I think there's a lot of kumbayas on that. But I think zooming in on Southeast Asia for me is certainly the best choice that we should do in the next few years.
Okay. And point well taken that as much as Africa is not a monolith, neither is Asia. Right. So we could have many conversations on, Singapore versus Vietnam versus Malaysia versus Thailand, different opportunities and obviously also different challenges in any of those countries, right? Similar to Africa.
Claudia, I had a point there.
Go ahead with
when we talk of collaboration, I think one of the important aspects of collaboration not happening, which if could happen, could be beneficial for Africa overall, could be for trade, not only with the rest of the world, but with trade within Africa. And that's an important aspect of collaboration, which sounds theoretical today, but if that can be done, could be extremely beneficial for that continent.
Yeah, INSEAD Africa, very, very true. Just in terms of, from personal experience from traveling from A to B, not easy inside Africa, neither are trade flows necessarily inside Africa. So there's headroom as well for some of those associations on the ground to potentially come together in different countries and explore what can be done. By the way, also, when you look back in history, that's how a lot of larger trade associations started, right? Bilateral first, trilateral agreements, and then basically expansion further on. So
Can I add something, Claudia?
Go ahead, Manya.
Just one quick point. I wanted to say there isn't maybe a coordinated effort, but I think what's happening is that a lot of African countries are sort of following each other. So, for example, the example I used where the government in Zimbabwe, put in a law to say that lithium should be processed first before it leaves, we saw that trickle down to other African countries that had lithium that saw that working, because within literally a year or so, there were processing plants that were set up. So other African countries started following. So we still have a lot of work to go in terms of coordinating it, but I think when one does something and it works, others follow.
Yeah. No, very good point. And it's kind of interesting to kind of observe this in the future. Where will those kind of like centers of energy, and I don't mean this in terms of energy in the ground, but just centers of development, where will they pick up, right? Will it be Zimbabwe? Will it be Nigeria, right now the largest country in Africa? How about Egypt? How about the North African nations, which are getting a lot of attention from the Middle East right now? So there's an argument to be made that there could be growth happening as well in whatever shape or form. It'll be interesting to see. And I think given the size of Africa, we need a couple of centers of energy to really drive development there going forward. I have one question, which is quite much more generic, which came in very early on. What's the best way to distribute, ultimately, wealth back to the public and not to the government or individuals at all, but any ideas on how to let basically the broader population benefit from any of the trade, the development, and so on? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think,
Dominique, go ahead.
I think before to think about trade, one of the huge spot of difference, for instance, between Asia and Africa in my industry is the very low value proposition. When I look in the stores in Nigeria of what we import from China, And most of those goods could be made in Nigeria. And I think there's a lot of missing opportunity. Even the vendor base, I mean, any non-food buyer in Asia would have to manage a portfolio of 200, 300, 400. And in Nigeria, it's probably 30, 40. And why? And so talking about value before to distribute, and the trade for me is not the solution. It's a transition. But there's a lot of categories and goods which should be produced in Africa. And this is probably a good way to start.
Okay. I think, Joshua, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Claudia. It's just a question that I feel quite passionate about personally, right? In my younger days, I also, like the many students here in INSEAD, in today's session, ask a lot of macro questions about how to make some changes and impact. And then through, being working on like African issues or business for almost 20 years now, I think it arrives to me, right? The real question is to say, what can I do? What can you do individually? What can you do individually? Because there's too many macro questions, but too many things that needs to be done. And it's not being done for 50 years. And in that, right, I think is to want to get into business, where you guys are in INSEAD, right? I also went to business school. You should find business opportunity that you can do yourself, that you can lead a team, lead an organization, 50 people, a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people. You need that organization and they can make some change. And this way you can benefit, right? The people that your company, your organization impact. For example, right, one thing that I was able to do at OPay, right, my company, we figured out there's a big gap, just a story, right? Big gap between people can get cash. Basically, there's not enough bank accounts and ATM machines in the country. Everybody have a bank account, but not enough ATM machines. So the typical citizen of Nigeria, they have to take a bus for half an hour to get cash. And then wait under the sun for another half an hour in line of an ATM machine to get $20. That's all you can get for a day. So we process our POS terminals to a lot of agents. How many? And then we pass out POS terminals to 150,000 agents in Nigeria. So within about 3 years of time, we solved the cash accessibility issue in Nigeria. And this is historically the fastest that had happened, I think, except maybe for M-Pesa in Kenya. And that each one that has a terminal, POS terminal, becomes a job. Because just by sitting on the roadside, so your neighbor can come and give you cash, so you can transfer money into their bank account with the POS terminal, or vice versa. Just by doing that, people are willing to pay you 1% of the transaction fee because they don't have to take a bus for half an hour anymore, which is more expensive. Just by doing that, we created 150,000 jobs in the country within 2 years. And we were more highly valued as a company, more highly valued within 2 years than the biggest banks in Nigeria that have been there for 40, 50 years.
Yeah. So since you're starting on opportunities, I have basically one question that comes from one of our MBAs that asking about sectors, region where basically talent is sought after, African or international talent. Like, do you have any your favorite areas? Where would you go as a young MBA who wants to get engaged in Africa and gets excited about the opportunities there?
Yeah, my strongest belief there is really, I think like all sector has the Chinese saying, right? Like all sector produces experts, right? Require like good people. So I think you can become a king in any sector. Like I love, for example, right, that Fish's title, right? He's head of rice, and that he does so much there. Right? Just hearing him talk, you can just tell he's doing so much there. Right, all the panelists. Right? I feel like all opportunities and all sectors just pick something they can go deep into. With technology, with fintech, with internet, you can go much faster. Right? That's one of the sectors that I'm familiar with. I think you can go quite fast there to figure out, and because the way you scale and you get venture capital money.
Okay. But, you have your top 2 or 3 countries.
Again, I think all countries are good. But the biggest country, right, in Africa as a whole, right, for bigger businesses opportunities is
So the top
Nigeria,
three are
Egypt,
Nigeria, Ethiopia,
South,
and Egypt, right? So in terms of size.
South Africa, Ethiopia, exactly.
And South Africa. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Let me just have a look at the questions here. I had a question for Debashish, also from a student. How do you mitigate the high carry cost of small grains in East Africa? So this is really right up your alley. And do you see potentials in big yield improvements in the next decade?
Let me answer the second question first. Potentials for yield improvement in the next decade, specifically out of East and West Africa, I definitely think. And the simple logic to that is the current yields are just not good enough, and hence the room for growth is available. So if things are done right, the potential for yield growth definitely is there. The first question was the high carry cost.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand that question.
Okay, I will get the student to reach out directly to you. So whoever the student is, please send me an email. I connect you with Debashish, okay? Fantastic. So now, one final question. I mean, something that comes up, especially in my space very often, is the question on allowing Africa or helping Africa to grow. How do you see this with regards to Africa's growth in a way that is kind of sustainable? I mean, you can interpret it in the widest sense, be it from an environmental point of view, be it from the point of view, like the earlier question, to ensure broader wealth distribution. So any thoughts, any opportunities there on the sustainability? So Manika, I'm going to start with you. You have your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Claudia. I think Africa has a resource that's not talked about a lot. There are many resources, but one key resource I think is talented young people that can become great entrepreneurs. But what they need is first of all, favorable laws. They need laws that will allow them to operate. In the example that Joshua used, if the government had put in a law that didn't allow you to put those POS systems, then you wouldn't be able to do that. So you need favorable laws that allow the entrepreneurs to operate. That's number one. And then number two, they need access to the right capital, not just any capital, but the right capital. And I remember what you said earlier on about the PE and VC funds. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the right capital at this point. What the capital that's needed right now is capital that allows African entrepreneurs to fail, to figure it out, to go through that whole process of fine-tuning their businesses until they become investable. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of capital like that, that's patient enough to allow them to go through that process. And I think, if there was more access to that kind of capital, and you get out of the way of the entrepreneurs by putting laws that stifle them, I think you would see, probably a lot of growth and also the wealth being distributed a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, it also goes back. We had a question early on that I saw from the corner of my eye about a cohesive legal framework, cohesive environment across Africa. I mean, I think it's a tall order with 54 different countries, but it goes back to what you mentioned as well, right? We need at least some certainty when you set up a company when you're running the company and you're doing well, that the government will not, come up with curveballs to impede your growth and your well-being as a company. So any other questions?
No, just a quick comment on what Manika mentioned. I think I completely agree with him. It's in Africa, like everywhere else, all you have to do is to educate people, to provide equal opportunities to everybody and not put barriers and let the market forces play. Once that happens, this whole thing around redistribution, I think it finds an automatic mechanism.
So we're almost out of time. Can I maybe ask all of you, having heard what we discussed, maybe for one or two sentences of a final comment before we basically thank our students for organizing and bringing us together? So Dominique, would you like to start? Would you like with a final comment, please?
Yeah, so there is something which is very dear to my heart and we didn't touch. It's the untapped capability of women in Africa. And we need to talk about this at least for a few seconds, because especially in my industry, we discover that there's so many women that are so bright that they are very undervalued, for different cultural reasons, or even but for economic reason. And well trained and given the opportunity and many opportunities, this is a formidable resources in terms of resilience, inventivity, creativity, and service, and very agile, nimble, and very entrepreneur. So I think I wanted to say this because it's a huge resource which we need to tap on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Devashish, please.
Thank you, Claudia. Yes, I mean, all I want to say is for all the students and the other people who are listening in, Africa really is for us, the way we see it, is a land of opportunities. And opportunity is not from a point of view of exploiting, opportunity is from a point of view that there is so much headroom to grow. The world of today, which is struggling to make a green shift towards virtually everything that you do, when Africa is starting with a lot of things to be done, the opportunities to actually create a green world, Africa will provide the opportunity to the rest of the world today.
Manika.
Yes, thank you, Claudia. Yes, I think Africa presents lots of opportunities. Yes, there are challenges, but if you have the stomach to work through those challenges and you come with the right mindset of genuinely wanting to partner with the African countries and the African entrepreneurs, I think there are a lot of opportunities that you can get into. So it's really about your mindset. It's about your stomach, your patience, and just your desire to make something work. But there are a lot of opportunities, and I think it's where the future is going to be. It's kind of like how China was maybe with the entrepreneurs in the late 90s, early 2000s. We're seeing similar type of entrepreneurs in Africa, and if they could just get the right support and right partners, I think we're going to see Africa growing tremendously.
Okay, actually, I'm going to come back to you with another question because I've just been given an extra 15 minutes by our admin. So anyway, but Paulo, maybe like final comment, like anything that we haven't heard yet that we should be discussing.
Yeah, I think it's how you want to enter the African market with a different mindset, because this new generation is not in a discourse of help. Africa doesn't need help. They need partners to do business. So I think there's a change in mindset and change in narrative. The second thing is the importance to understand the African risk. Africa is risky, no doubt, in many fronts, but you need to understand the African risk. It's not because you have war in Ukraine that all the Western Europe is not an investable region. And the same time, there's when you have conflict in Sudan, that doesn't mean that the whole Africa is a risky place. So I think that aspect needs to be a factor in. And then finally, I think you mentioned about private equity. I've been in private equity with some people, but I think what we need in Africa is not just private equity. We need a process of capital formation to infuse money as a venture capital, essentially, because many things need to be greenfield. A private equity will go only on brownfield, on things that have already shown progress, but the real opportunity in Africa is in total greenfield in any vertical, whether it's food, whether it's industry, and I think more research and more work need to be done, because that's exactly the type of capital that Africa needs at this point.
So what we're needing is real risk capital, right? So and I would add to that on that point that Africa itself has quite a considerable amount of wealth. That wealth needs to be organized, be it from the sovereign wealth funds, in a way that it invests back into its kind of fledgling companies, into its startups. So we're seeing this slowly, some of the vehicles being set up, but there's no reason why Africa needs to rely only on international external funding, right? So plenty of wealth available. Joshua, you wanna add one line that we haven't talked about yet, and then I'm going to open up actually for another question on Singaporean companies entering Africa. Go ahead.
I just want to encourage the audience today, presumably mostly INSEAD MBA students, right? I think among all the things, among wealth and investable money, Africa needs managers, people who can come in organization and say, well, I have 5 people reporting to me, I have 500, I have 50,000 people reporting to me. How am I going to organize them every day, solve hundreds of challenges, right? Just like in the Silicon Valley, just like in Chinese, right? People who started Taobao and Xiaomi in China. So people will need managers who come in, find the opportunity, and every day very practically solve the 5, 10, 20 problems that you have that day, and do it repeatedly every day for 1,000 to 2,000 times, right? 2 to 6 years.
Right. So basically transfer your knowledge on process, right? Inside how to manage a business at whatever stage of its growth, right?
Yeah. So Africa needs the most is you.
Okay.
I want to say to audience
right.
today is this.
Very good. So now, since we have been given now it's 10 minutes. So an extra 10 minutes. I had a couple of questions that all allude around the same one. So clearly coming from people that are sitting in Asia, some of them in Singapore, saying, what do you suggest? What do I do if I, as a business in Southeast Asia, want to enter Africa? Some people specifically asking about South Africa. Do you have any suggestions? So, of course, I guess what we are gonna, what Paulo is gonna suggest is join the Southeast Asia Africa Chamber of Commerce. So maybe you can fly the flag there. But any suggestions? So, Manika, you're always the fastest one with a hand. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, like I said initially, it's about the mindset you come in with. So first come in with genuinely looking, like what Paulo just said. Africa now is not looking, it does not have its hand out, looking for a handout or for charity. Africans, the new breed of Africans that's there, want genuine partnerships and want people that come in looking for genuine partnerships. So your mindset has to be that you're coming in to genuinely partner. Number 2, you need to understand government policy. You really need to get into it and understand, the impact of government policy, and if possible, align your business model to the government policy, because you access certain, concessions or tax benefits that you can get. Number 3, I would say you'd need to get a great local partner. I wouldn't say go it alone. You definitely need a great local partner. Do your due diligence. Make sure that you get somebody who understands the government policy and obviously has good relationships with the government. Secondly, that understands the markets that you want to operate in and what you're trying to achieve. And also that you click and understand each other and are able to work together well. So I think getting a great local partner is something that you need. And then I think lastly, I would just say, just know that there will be challenges. But just have a long-term view and be willing to work through those challenges, because things change. One thing that's constant is change, and a challenge today may not necessarily be a challenge 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So sometimes you have to just stick it through and until things change. But if you're coming with a long-term view, I think you can access a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, the one thing you can be ensured is that your target market, in the widest sense, however you define it, will surely grow. Because the one thing that's certain is the angle on the demographic side, right? Any other suggestion? Devashish, maybe on your side, because you're literally straggling Southeast Asia or Asia and Africa. Any advice you can give people? Maybe what to do and maybe what not to do. So.
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what Paulo mentioned or what Manika mentioned. I think it is very important when you get to these countries in the African continent to be first aware of the risk-reward balance. A lot of us go there, or a lot of people go there, and because they have not evaluated the risk or the government policies that Monica correctly mentioned, it always seems to them that the risk-reward is very imbalanced. Getting to understand that is very important. That's the first. The second thing is, especially when you go out of countries like Singapore, you've got to be aware of the infrastructure barriers that come your way when you get to try and do a business in countries in Africa. You've got to be cognizant of that. Third, I would say, is try and get into Africa if you really are there to try and understand a need or solve a problem. That's when the real rewards for entering there could be felt. Otherwise, if you're trying to just replicate a /copy entry into Africa for what somebody has already done, you will probably get in there and struggle more than what you would have otherwise thought of.
Yeah, thank you. Paulo, you want to add anything to that, to the points made?
I think do your homework. It's important to do your homework. Find a good partner before you go, to have a sense of that partner you need there, because they will, our economy is still very much regulated, and we still have the state playing a role in many sectors. So the interaction and the resilience in the relationship with the government is very important. That doesn't mean that you get into the politics, but you have to be able to predict what's going to happen in the politics. It is possible if you have a local partner who has also, unfortunately, it's difficult to go with a bank. The ideal would have been if you are a Singaporean or you are a Malaysian, so you go to Africa for business, to have your bank coming with you, or at least following you in the relationship with the local banks in Africa. It's important, because even if you do some basic commercial thing, you need the corresponding bank, you need to transfer the money. So it's good to see, even if most of the banks in Asia are still quite cautious in getting into the African ecosystem, but at least engage your bank, and then you will find a local bank in Africa. The good news now is that you have many Africans now who have created banks. So the financial system, at least the banking system, is now more and more in the hand of Africans. So those banks understand the African risk. They are not into the long-term financing. They are very commercial, very short-term, because of, the nature of the deposit. But I think those are elements you could do. So do your homework, find a good partner, make sure someone follow you with there. And then when you are in the country, all the points that Maika and Darvish has underlined are basically your to-do list.
Yeah, exactly. Dominique, any comments in addition to advice to Southeast Asian or Asian counterparts entering Africa?
No, it's really absolutely about understanding your audience and do your homework. But a point that was mentioned, but I want to reiterate, is you need to make sure that you create value. And if it's just a me too or copy what you have been doing, it won't work. And I think this is quite crucial. In terms of choosing a partner, I've been managing a lot of partnership in my previous life. You have to also to be very careful on what kind of partner you are going in bed with. And do you need a majority or not? To manage partnership, there's 4 fundamentals, KPIs, where you need to share the same objective, etc., and both parties need to add value, and so it's not that simple. The choice of a partner, it's something that must be very well prepared and curated. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can add what Dominique was saying. I think in partner, that's true. But it's countries in Africa are very large, but at the same time very small. So if someone is crook, it's not very difficult to know after a month if this guy that you are trying to go to bed with is crook. So I think sometimes people ignore those signals early on, because the appetite for profit is there. But I think in most of the time you can, if you do your homework before and you do your homework when you arrive, you could find the right partner.
And choose your partners wisely. Okay, Joshua, any comments on helping a Southeast Asian company to enter Africa, or any do's or any don't do's?
Yeah, I would approach it in a very, I think classical, almost business school way, right? I think one thing that is important to me personally that I find very helpful is to look at who is similar to you that is already there, and then it becomes a little bit nuanced, right? So the presence for some big competitors can tell you both that the market has potential, your business and your product and services has demand, you need to work, or that the market is already saturated. Those big guys, right, they're already top 2 players in the market, and the structure is set. It's hard to disturb. But one thing to look at is who are the top 2 players in the market, and then go deep into it. Right. One thing that I do practically, for example, is I work with a lot of expert interview firms. So those are companies that you can pay a few $1,000s for an hour, right? Just to talk to them. You can talk to senior executives of your current competitor or peer locally, and ask them about all these things in the market and get a good sense.
Okay.
So just some practical, yes.
Very, very tangible advice. So on that note, I wanted to thank all our panelists. Thank you so much for making time. Thank you for trying to tackle this arguably very large topic, to trying to peel the onion on how we can connect Southeast Asia with Africa and where the opportunities lie. So thank you very much. And we will now we will hang up on our live audience. The recording will be made available in the coming days. So thank you very much again to our student club for organizing this.